In 1927, French filmmaker Abel Gance released the silent film Napoleon veut pas Abel Gance, and what many consider to be his master work, with its initial release running nearly 4 hours in length. While it spearheaded many now commonplace techniques in cinema, it eventually faded from the public eye, only being left in the hands of those with duplicate film reels until film historian Kevin Brownlow began to reconstruct the film before re-releasing it in 1979 with a near 5-hour runtime. That would increased to 5.5 hours by the year 2000, and that has remained the constant runtime even upon its first home video release in 2016. There's only one problem though. The full movie's definitive release in May of 1927 ran at 9 hours and 22 minutes, meaning 90 years after its release, 4 hours of footage is still missing. Tragic for film enthusiasts, isn't it? Surely though, the same could never happen to games, could it? Well, not exactly. You see, back in 1995, Nintendo released the Satellaview add-on for the SNES, that, for a subscription fee, allowed players to tune into scheduled game broadcasts of original and unique titles, accompanied by a live narrator who would give you hints on what to do and where to go. The only downside was each broadcast had about an hour runtime before you had to stop playing and wait for the next one. However, one of the more notorious titles to grace the platform was BS Zelda no Densetsu, essentially a remix of the original Zelda title. Naturally, for the most hardcore Zelda enthusiasts, it's somewhat of a must-play, but there's only one issue. The only available ROM dump of the game came from its third-week broadcast, meaning that what we're left with is an incomplete game. But fans aren't ones to be so easily defeated, and like Kevin Brownlow's efforts before them, using archive footage of the last week, they were able to reconstruct most of the final broadcast, albeit without a timer and the narration. What we're left with isn't quite what Japanese players woke up to play back in 1995, but rather the alternative. And you'd think we know better by now, but truth is we don't. While you can go out and digitally purchase most any game or film released in the last few decades no problem, that doesn't mean there still aren't pieces lost to the annals of time. The most egregious and short-term example in games will always be online titles like MMOs. World of Warcraft and Destiny may be up and playable today, but once those servers shut down, that's it. Those games are effectively gone forever, and that extends further into older digital services. Sure, digital downloads are convenient and save on disk swapping, but they're a hard commitment to your purchase, and you've essentially signed away your right to ownership. Once a game, DRM free or not, is removed from market, if you don't have it downloaded, it could be gone for good. So if you happen to own a PS4 with PT, should anything happen to corrupt your storage data, it's gone forever, and that's an effect that's only going to become more problematic as the years go by. One day the Wii Shop channel and the PS3's PSN store will shut down, and with them goes your digital purchases, effectively turning your game library into an expensive digital sticker book. But even if you manage to get your hands on a physical copy of a game, without those networks you're barred off from things like DLC and content updates that can greatly transform the experience and even fix game-breaking issues. In extreme cases, you're essentially seeing a scenario like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, where the disc only contains the bare minimum amount of content, while the majority of the game is downloaded via an update. So should you buy it on console and their servers ever shut down, you're effectively left with a paperweight. But considering it's Pro Skater 5 we're talking about here, whether or not that's a good thing is up to you. So you have a lot of collectors and average Joes concerned with the longevity of their purchases going strictly physical when able, to at least have some sense of control and ownership over their purchases. However, even that isn't a guaranteed method of preserving those games. Every CD, console, and cartridge will eventually expire. In fact, it's already happening to older consoles. Sega Saturns have been plagued with dying optical drives for years, and now those problems are starting to affect other disc-based systems like the PS1 and Dreamcast. So on account of being decade-old hardware, not only is official tech support no longer offered, but their parts have long since been discontinued, meaning we have to scavenge other systems for repairs we can't do with towels.
Alright, this probably isn't very smart, but it's my only source to watch movies, and I'm desperate.
Otherwise, we're left waiting till a third party deems it worth their interest to pursue developing replacement parts. We still have alternatives though. After the Wii's disk drive started dying, people got creative and started modding their systems to read games off USB drives, and DS users have been using flash carts for more elusive titles. Their CDs, on the other hand, are no problem, expected to last up to 200 years if well kept. And even cartridge-based systems and games can last decades if not a century, but with a catch. Chances are, if you try to load up a save from Pokemon Crystal on the Game Boy Color, your game's save battery is dead and your save file gone with it. Now, replacing a battery in a console in old games is not a huge issue because those parts still see plentiful use, but there is the odd exception of the Philips CDI, where the battery is built into the system's RAM chip, making it possible to permanently break the console if you even try and replace it. The reasoning comes from the fact that the battery is expected to last 25 years, a point at which the platform will no longer be in production and the company will have already made all they can off the system. But as other consoles like the Dreamcast and Xbox begin to decay, the more people will fight for their parts, and there will be a massive surge in their resale value, working or not. But even if we can't preserve the consoles, we can still keep the games because they're the ultimate end goal of our purchase, and that's where things start to become a bit more complicated. If the game in question is already on a discontinued system and hasn't seen a port in over 20 years, that means there's a very high price for that product in question. And since reprinting tends to die along with the console a game is on, that means there will only ever be less and less copies in circulation at higher and higher costs. So once a game like Panzer Dragoon Saga reaches a price too large to be acceptable to the average game enthusiast, the act of playing said game starts to stop being a hobby and more of a luxury. An issue that's only compounded upon if that applies to Nintendo games that use Amiibo and the like. What that means for a lot of people is most games are essentially barred off from being playable until they inevitably see a re-release via remasters, remakes, or simple digital ports. Not only does it offer convenience on not having to plug in multiple consoles to enjoy all your games, but it means costs can be controlled and set at more reasonable consumer-friendly prices, and that even influences the value of physical goods. I remember Final Fantasy VII running for well over $150 on eBay back in high school, but with its $10 re-release on PS3 alongside its PC and PS4 release, you can now buy the PS1 original for dirt cheap. But even if the prices don't drop, spending $5 on a digital copy of Shantae is better than the $400 physical alternative. However, a new problem facing consumers now is these digital purchases have reached a point on Nintendo and Sony platforms where they're no longer being carried forward. If you want to play Final Fantasy VII on your PS4 and already own it on your PS3 or physical, then tough luck, you're gonna have to buy it all over again. The tech is there, but Sony's made it clear they don't want to shell out the money to develop backwards compatibility, and part of that reasoning stems from the financial burden that was the PS3 through most of its lifespan. Instead, they're re-releasing classics like Parappa and Shadow of the Colossus via HD remakes, while PS2 games are being re-released in full HD, with trophy support to set them apart from their previous iterations. It's operating under the guise of a better, more complete package, but at the end of the day, you're buying the same game again, but that doesn't mean you're getting the same experience. And that extends further into their PlayStation Now service, where players can rent PS3 games across multiple devices for a hefty subscription fee. But there the problem lies in the fact that you're playing games not only on that weaker hardware being streamed at a fluctuating bitrate, thus leading to compressed visuals, but there will always be latency issues between what you're seeing and what you're playing as a result of the streaming itself. That only hampers the experience of anything that isn't turn-based, meaning it's just another way of getting you to pay for what you already own and then some. For most, that's simply good enough, despite good enough being a defeatist acknowledgement that we're fine with being fed schlock so long as it looks pretty. Parappa and Crash are notorious for their changes by now, both visually and mechanically, and even if they're improved in some places and worse in others, you still have the originals to return to. The problem is that it's not financially beneficial for business, so even if the next console is so homogenized in its structure that it's natively backwards compatible with the last gen, companies will just flip a switch that says no so they can continue building consoles meant to erase history. Also, they can just back you into a corner where they can repackage it and sell it to you all over again while marketing it as the definitive must-have version, even if it isn't. While those games are certainly products of their times, they're also a product of the mentalities and influences on the developers themselves. But the original staffers aren't always guaranteed to work on those enhanced versions, and the more you reiterate upon an idea, the more you start making concessions and lose sight of what the original represented. And that can have a major impact on how your game is consumed and digested. It's odd then that the only company offering that consumer goodwill is Microsoft with the Xbox One's 360 backwards compatibility, soon to be extended to the original Xbox. But what makes it strange is it shows two very real points that make this issue so heated. The first is the previously mentioned experience. While lasting value is certainly an issue on its own, I think what we're more concerned with is making sure an experience so dearly loved is preserved or improved upon so we can share it with others. The second issue is that, for most people, people, not every game is worth preserving, and that's not exactly a wrong opinion to have. Most Steam Greenlight games are better off in the trash, but you'd be damned for suggesting Suikoden 2 be lost to time itself. So with both these mentalities, we often conclude that only one version of a game can prevail, while the rest must be forgotten. After all, history is a very fickle thing where we decide what is and what isn't worth preserving. While there might be over a dozen Titanic films, we only remember the one because we consider it definitive to our culture. The others might be a fun romp, but ultimately they're throwaway, and that's the exact mentality most companies carry with them, game or not. To them, they're just as much worth as the box your shoes came in, bought to be dazzled at and thrown away 5 seconds later. But at least there I get to keep the shoes, which in this case I guess would be the experience. But what most don't realize is the shoebox's equivalent is the damn box the game came in. Truth be told, and I'm sure most sane people already know this, if the consumer isn't making companies as much money as possible, they don't matter, nor do the goods they own, even if they're a large part of their history. It's a shame because digital preservation is possibly the best solution to physically degrading goods, but again, it comes at the cost of your right to ownership. So if a company wanted to shut down their digital service, make you lose access to everything you own, and post a slightly enhanced version up for sale on their new device, and that's where ownership becomes an issue, because no one wants to buy Urban Champion every time they get a new Nintendo console. Luckily, we have systems like the Retron 5 dedicated to playing classic games, so we can still get value out of those physical goods. And for less available titles, we also have emulation, and yes, both are surprisingly legal despite what you may think. But emulation isn't a guarantee either. Emulators are, more or less, following guidelines to brute force games into playable states. As a result, you have imperfections in some titles that devs can work on fixing in the next update, but these issues are surprisingly samey. Dolphin is a very prolific emulator that plays Wii and GameCube games. However, in the mid-2000s, Nintendo, in a joint partnership with Namco and Sega, released a series of arcade machines running on a system highly comparable to GameCube hardware. These arcade games, running on a system called the Triforce board, cannot be emulated by Dolphin without resorting to those dedicated builds. And even then, they haven't updated in over 3 years. But at that point, why are people so upset about preservation, and why should developers concern themselves with it? Well, it's clear to say not everyone is aware of emulation, only knowing what they see on TV and the eShop, and plenty of others want to support developers in a series they love. But to put it simply, it's the attitude companies often have towards their own IP. What we love to them is often meaningless. Sure, we can't always get what we want in the form of sequels, but we can still enjoy what we do have because it might be all we ever get, even if the devs themselves want to see more of said franchise. Thankfully, we have places like GOG where classic games are kept up to date for the latest operating system. Because they're DRM free, they'll still be viable 2 decades from now. But we also have Capcom, who wants to make sure you have Street Fighter 2 no matter what. But on console, it's ultimately up to the big 3 on whether or not we can get continued use out of what we own. And for all except Microsoft, instilling consumer goodwill isn't as viable as instilling anti-consumer spending habits, especially when your console is doing so well you can get away with it. But alas, this is the world we live in. Forced to buy, consume, and lose in a never-ending cycle, never truly owning what's ours. God damn it. Hey, I'm not dead. In fact, I'm doing very well outside being a little bit sick. Don't cancel 30-minute videos, kids. You pay for it with 2 months of nothing. Be sure to turn on notifications if you haven't already, and be sure to follow me on Twitter for future updates. And until then, because I only have 20 seconds to do this, I'll see you next time. Much love.